On New Year's Eve, the neighborhood was quiet, the faint sound of fireworks in the distance. Inside a cozy suburban home, a young man settled into his routine. At 23, freshly graduated and single, his nights were often spent in quiet solitude. The living room was warm and inviting, the glow of a lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. He relaxed on the couch, soda in hand, as the New Year's special flickered on the TV. Time passed slowly, the clock nearing midnight, but beneath the calm exterior of the night, an unseen presence was waiting to disturb the peace. The convenience store was brightly lit, a stark contrast to the dark streets outside. As he selected soda and snacks, the quiet evening felt ordinary, uneventful. But that changed when a group of teenagers entered. Their laughter was sharp, their movements uneasy, like predators searching for prey. He glanced their way, catching whispers and mocking stares. Words like nerd and loser floated through the air, biting and intrusive. Paying for his items, he tried to shake off the unease. Leaving the store, he quickened his pace, their sneering voices following him into the night like a haunting echo. The road stretched before him, quiet and empty, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The night air was crisp, and the sound of distant fireworks faintly echoed in the background, 2014 a reminder of the celebrations taking place in other homes. As he drove, he felt a sense of relief, leaving behind the unsettling encounter at the convenience store. The group of teenagers was probably just that 2014 a group of immature kids looking for someone to mock. Yet, as he adjusted his rear-view mirror, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. Headlights gleamed faintly in the distance behind him. They were in 2019 to unusual. It was New Year 2019's Eve, after all, and plenty of people were out late. But something about these lights felt 2026 off. They remained constant, following at a steady pace, not too close, not too far. He dismissed the thought. It 2019's just a car heading the same way, he reassured himself. The street grew darker as he turned into his suburban neighborhood. The familiar sight of his block brought a momentary sense of comfort. The glow of porch lights and holiday decorations lined the quiet houses. His own home came into view, its warm, welcoming light beckoning him forward. But the car behind him was still there. He made a quick decision, slowing slightly to let the car pass, hoping to shake off the gnawing suspicion growing in the back of his mind. But instead of speeding ahead, the vehicle matched his pace, keeping a careful distance. Panic began to settle in. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his palms slick with sweat. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Were they following him? Could it be the teenagers from the store? It seemed absurd, but he couldn't 2019 ignore the possibility. His heart began to pound in his chest as he turned onto his driveway. As he parked and stepped out of the car, he glanced down the street. The headlights had disappeared and the road was silent. For a moment he felt foolish. You knew 2019 or just imagining things, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But the unease lingered. As he approached his front door, he felt an inexplicable urge to turn around, as though invisible eyes were watching his every move. The street was empty, yet the weight of the unseen pressed against him. Hurrying inside, he locked the door behind him and set his bag of snacks on the counter. His home felt safe, secure, but the lingering paranoia clung to him like a shadow. Could they have followed him? Or was it all just a coincidence? He shook off the thoughts and made his way to the couch, determined to enjoy the rest of his night. The New Year 2019 special was already in full swing, the colorful lights and lively music filling the room with a sense of normalcy. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, he couldn't 2019 to shake the feeling that something was 2019 right. Somewhere, out in the darkness, danger was lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The night had grown colder, the celebratory sounds of fireworks more sporadic as the hours crept toward dawn. Inside his home, he was oblivious to the figures lurking outside. The curtains were drawn, the locks he thought secured, and the warmth of his living room cocooned him in a false sense of safety. But out in the yard, the night was alive with the whispers of trouble. They came in shadows, slipping across the lawn like wraiths under the pale glow of the moon and streetlights. The group of teenagers from the convenience store had returned, their intentions darker than their mocking laughter had hinted. They huddled together, their breath visible in the cold night air. Lighters flicked in their hands, briefly illuminating their faces, twisted with mischief and malice. One of them motioned toward the house, his voice a low murmur drowned out by the crackle of a distant firework. Another laughed, the sound harsh and sharp, like glass breaking in the stillness. They moved closer, their footsteps careful and deliberate, leaving faint impressions in the frost-covered grass. Inside, he stirred briefly on the couch. A muffled thump reached his ears, but in his drowsy state, he dismissed it as nothing more than the sound of his neighbors celebrating. He glanced at the clock at 21:42:15 a.m. Sleep was calling, and he barely had the energy to respond to his growing unease. "I locked the door," he thought, as if the words could erase the faint worry gnawing at the edge of his mind. Outside, the teenagers were at the doorstep now, their lighters illuminating the door U-2019's handle. They whispered among themselves, debating their next move. The leader tried the handle, and to their surprise, it turned. Slowly, the door creaked open, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. One by one, they slipped inside, their movements as silent as the night. The faint sound of their sneakers on the hardwood floor was barely audible. The house felt colder as they moved through it, their eyes scanning every detail, every corner. They passed the kitchen, their faces lit briefly by the soft glow of an appliance clock. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint murmur of the TV in the living room. Down the hallway they crept, drawn to the light seeping from beneath a closed door. They paused, exchanging glances, their smiles more sinister now. One of them placed his hand on the doorknob, turning it ever so slowly. In his room, he slept soundly, unaware of the danger just beyond the threshold. The door creaked open, and the group stepped inside. Whatever they did in those moments remains a mystery, 2014 secret locked in the darkness of that room. But after what felt like an eternity, they emerged, leaving as quietly as they had entered. Outside, the faint laughter of the group echoed once more as they vanished into the night. Inside, he slept on, blissfully unaware of how close he had come to harm, unaware that his perceived sanctuary had been so easily breached. The morning light streamed through the windows, cutting through the lingering unease of the previous night. Sitting at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, he tried to brush off the odd sense of discomfort that clung to him. It had been nothing, he thought, 2014, just the paranoia of a mind too tired to reason. But a flicker of curiosity urged him to check his security footage, if only to confirm that the night had been as uneventful as it should have been. He opened his laptop, pulling up the recordings from the night before. At first, the feed showed only the familiar quiet of his front yard, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The occasional sound of a car passing by or a burst of distant fireworks was all that broke the stillness. He fast-forwarded, the footage blurring through the hours, until something caught his eye. His heart skipped a beat as the figures appeared. The group of teenagers from the convenience store emerged from the shadows, their movements cautious yet deliberate. They lingered in the yard, their laughter muted, their faces partially illuminated by the flicker of their lighters. He leaned closer to the screen, his pulse quickening as he recognized them. It was the same group that had mocked him just hours earlier. The footage played on, his breath catching in his throat as he watched them approach his front door. One of them reached out, trying the handle, and to his horror, the door swung open. A cold realization washed over him. UTT-40 Hadnu 2019 T locked it. He froze, his mind racing with questions and fears. The camera inside the hallway captured their entry. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps silent, their shadows stretching long under the dim light of the hallway lamp. They hesitated, exchanging glances before splitting up, their figures disappearing into different parts of the house. He clenched his fists, helpless as he watched strangers invade his sanctuary. Then came the moment that made his stomach turn. The teenagers approached his bedroom door. The camera outside the room captured them pausing, whispering among themselves, and finally opening the door. He watched them vanish into his room, and the feed from the hallway showed only an empty corridor. 5 minutes passed to 2014, 5 agonizingly long minutes. His screen displayed nothing but an empty, quiet hallway, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. What were they doing in there? Why had they come? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered, each one darker than the last. Finally, the figures re-emerged, slipping back into the hallway. Their expressions remained unreadable, their movements just as deliberate as when they entered. They exited the house, leaving the front door slightly ajar as they disappeared into the night. His hands trembled as the footage ended. The reality of what had happened crashed down on him. He had been so close to danger, so vulnerable, and yet he had slept through it all. The thought was paralyzing. The only thing more chilling than what he saw was what he didn't. 2019 TSU 2014, what they had done inside his room during those 5 minutes of silence. Morning light filled the room, but its warmth did little to chase away the cold dread that now gripped him. Sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open before him, he couldn't shake the memory of what he had seen in the footage. He had replayed the events of the night again and again, hoping to uncover something he might have missed, some detail that would make it all less terrifying. But the truth was clear. They had been inside his home. The realization gnawed at him. How had they found his house? Had they followed him from the convenience store? Or was it all a sick coincidence? He couldn't say for certain, but the unsettling truth was that they had been there, walking through his hallways, standing in his bedroom while he slept just a few feet away. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had checked every corner of his house that morning, combing through his belongings for any signs of tampering, theft, or vandalism. But nothing was missing. Not a single drawer was out of place, not a single item disturbed. It was almost worse that way. 2014, the lack of explanation for their actions made their visit feel more sinister. What had they been looking for? What had they done in those 5 minutes in his room? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the television in the living room. He had left it on, desperate for some background noise to fill the oppressive silence of the house. A breaking news segment flashed across the screen, catching his attention. The anchor's voice was calm but firm as she relayed the story. A group of teenagers, suspected in a series of petty crimes, have been arrested after attempting to rob an elderly woman at gunpoint late last night. The suspects, all between the ages of 16 and 19, are now in police custody. Authorities believe the group may be connected to other incidents in the area. The screen displayed their mugshots, and his heart sank. It was them 2014, the same teenagers he had encountered at the convenience store, the same ones who had invaded his home. Seeing their faces on the screen was like a punch to the gut. It confirmed everything he had feared. For a moment, he felt a wave of relief knowing they were in custody, unable to harm anyone else. But that relief was fleeting. He couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind, couldn't stop wondering what might have happened if he had woken up during their intrusion. Would they have run, or would they have done something worse? He looked around his kitchen, at the locks on the windows and the deadbolt on the door. He would never take them for granted again. The lesson was clear. No matter how safe a neighborhood feels, no matter how mundane a night may seem, vigilance is everything. As the news segment ended, he closed his laptop and stood, his legs unsteady. From now on, he would double-check every lock, every window, every door. The world outside felt darker now, and he wasn't going to leave himself vulnerable again. The memory of those 5 minutes in his bedroom would haunt him for a long time, but it would also serve as a stark reminder 2014 sometimes. The real horror isn't what you see, but what you don't. The night was quiet again, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, almost oppressive. He moved through the house methodically, checking every window, every door. The faint hum of the heater was the only sound accompanying him as he double-checked each lock, ensuring there would be no repeats of the nightmare he had endured. His hands lingered on the deadbolt of the front door. The metallic click of the lock sliding into place echoed louder than it should have, reverberating in the empty hallway. He stared at the door for a moment, his mind replaying the image of it swinging open on the security footage, unguarded, vulnerable. Walking back through the darkened house, he paused in the hallway where the group had stood. He could almost feel their presence, 2014, a phantom chill that made his skin crawl. He shook his head and pressed on, his footsteps soft on the floor. Finally, He reached his bedroom. He stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the room as if it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. What had they done in here? Why hadn't they harmed him? The silence was suffocating, but he refused to let it break him. Before turning out the light, he checked the lock on his bedroom window, giving it an extra tug for good measure. He climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to his chest. The room felt cold, no matter how tightly he bundled himself. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he whispered into the empty room, as much to himself as to the unseen, "Never again." Outside, the wind howled softly, carrying with it the weight of lessons learned too late.